Ezra McCann sat on the edge of his bed in the dusty hotel room, staring at the blood on his handkerchief. It wasn't the first time he'd seen it there, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. The coughing fits were getting worse every day, and each one left him weaker than before. At 42 years old, he'd lived longer than most men who carried guns for a living, but time was catching up with him fast. The doctor in Silver City had been honest about it 3 months ago. Consumption, he'd called it. Some folks called it tuberculosis. Whatever name you put on it, it meant the same thing. Ezra's lungs were giving out, and there wasn't much anyone could do about it. The doctor had given him maybe 6 months if he was lucky, less if he kept pushing himself hard. Ezra folded the bloody cloth and tucked it into his vest pocket. Through the thin walls of the hotel, he could hear voices in the next room. 2 men, talking in low tones about bounties and rewards. His name came up more than once. Word traveled fast in the Arizona territory, and there were plenty of people who wanted to collect the price on his head. He'd been running from the law for the better part of 15 years. Bank robberies, cattle rustling, a few shootouts that went bad, nothing he was proud of now, but it was the life he'd chosen. Or maybe it had chosen him. Either way, he was tired of looking over his shoulder every minute of every day. The morning sun was already getting hot when Ezra made his decision. He couldn't keep running forever, especially not in his condition. Every day brought more weakness, more pain in his chest, more blood when he coughed. If he was going to die anyway, he wanted to do it somewhere quiet, away from bounty hunters and lawmen and all the noise of civilization. He packed his few belongings into his saddlebags. A spare shirt, some ammunition, a small bag of coins, and a faded photograph of his mother that he'd carried for 20 years. Everything else he'd left behind long ago. Travel light, stay mobile. That had been his way of life since he was 17 years old. His horse, a sturdy brown Marais named Dusty, was waiting in the stable behind the hotel. She'd been with him for 3 years now, through good times and bad. She was getting older too, but she still had spirit. When she saw him coming with the saddle, she nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder. "We're taking one last ride, old girl," he whispered to her as he threw the saddle blanket over her back. "Heading north, up toward Colorado. Find us a nice, quiet spot where nobody knows our names." The saddle felt heavier than usual as he lifted it onto Dusty's back. His hands shook a little as he tightened the cinch, and he had to stop twice to catch his breath. The sickness was taking more out of him than he wanted to admit, but he managed to get everything secure and pull himself up into the saddle. Riding out of town felt like leaving a weight behind. No more watching the shadows for familiar faces. No more sleeping with one eye open. No more wondering if today would be the day someone faster or smarter caught up with him. For the first time in months, Ezra felt something close to peace. The desert stretched out ahead of him, endless and empty. The kind of country that could swallow a man whole and never give him back. That suited him just fine. He wanted to disappear into it, find some forgotten corner where he could face whatever was coming without bringing trouble to anyone else. By noon, the sun was beating down hard, and Ezra was already feeling worn out. The coughing fits came more often when he was stressed or tired, and the long ride was taking its toll. Every few miles he had to stop and rest, letting Dusty drink from his water while he tried to catch his breath. The landscape around them was harsh but beautiful in its own way. Red rocks jutted up from the sandy ground like ancient monuments. Cactus plants dotted the hills, their arms reaching toward the cloudless sky. In the distance, purple mountains shimmered in the heat. It was the kind of country that made a man feel small, but also free. As the afternoon wore on, Ezra found himself thinking about the choices he'd made. How different things might have been if he'd taken another path. There had been opportunities over the years. A chance to work on a ranch in New Mexico. A woman in Tucson who'd wanted him to stay and try an honest life. A sheriff in a small town who'd offered to forget the past if Ezra would help keep the peace, but he'd always chosen to ride on. Always picked the easy money over the hard work. Always let fear of being trapped make him run from anything good. Now, with death following close behind, he wondered if he'd wasted the years he'd been given. The sun was getting low when Dusty started to stumble. She caught herself each time, but Ezra could feel her struggling beneath him. They'd covered maybe 30 miles since morning, which wasn't much by his old standards. But both of them were running on empty now. "Easy, girl," he said, patting her neck. "We'll find somewhere to rest soon." His own strength was fading fast. The constant motion of riding had triggered several coughing fits, and each one left him more drained than the last. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were shaking on the reins. He knew he couldn't go much further without water and rest. That's when he spotted the buildings in the distance. At first he thought it might be a mirage, something his tired mind was making up. But as they got closer he could see it was real. A cluster of wooden structures nestled in a small valley between two hills. It looked like an old mining town, the kind that sprang up wherever someone found gold or silver, then died when the veins played out. Most of the buildings were falling down, their roofs caved in and walls leaning at odd angles, but one structure, near the center of the settlement, looked intact. It was small and simple, with a wooden cross on top that marked it as a church. The sight of it stirred something in Ezra's chest, a memory of his childhood when his mother used to take him to Sunday services in a building much like this one. Dusty seemed to sense shelter ahead and picked up her pace a little. As they rode into the ghost town, Ezra could see that it had been abandoned for years. Weeds grew up through the wooden sidewalks. Windows stared empty and dark. The wind whispered through broken doorways, making a lonesome sound that matched how he felt inside, but the church looked different. Older, maybe, but solid. Like it had weathered the storms better than the other buildings, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. Ezra guided Dusty toward it, hoping to find shelter for what might be his final night under the stars. Ezra slid down from Dusty's back, his legs nearly giving out when his boots hit the ground. The ride had taken everything out of him, and for a moment he had to lean against his horse just to stay upright. His chest burned with each breath, and he could taste blood in his mouth again. But they'd made it to shelter, and that was what mattered now. The abandoned town stretched out around them like a graveyard of broken dreams. Ezra had seen plenty of places like this during his years of wandering. Boom towns that went bust when the gold ran out or the railroad passed them by. What struck him as odd was how complete the abandonment seemed. Usually a few stubborn folks stayed behind, trying to squeeze a living from whatever scraps were left. Here, it looked like everyone had packed up and left at the same time. He tied Dusty's reins to a hitching post that was still solid, then grabbed his saddlebags and the small bag of supplies he'd brought. The moray whinnied softly and nuzzled his shoulder, as if she sensed something strange about this place too. Ezra patted her neck and promised he'd find her some water soon. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, but weeds had grown up through the dirt, and tumbleweeds rolled across from one side to the other. On his left stood what used to be a general store, its painted sign so faded he could barely make out the words. The windows were broken, and when he peered inside he saw empty shelves. Covered in dust thick as snow. Next to the store was a saloon with swinging doors that creaked in the desert wind. Ezra pushed through them, curious despite his exhaustion. The inside was darker than expected, with enough light filtering through dirty windows to show overturned chairs and tables. Empty bottles lined the bar, and a broken mirror hung behind it, reflecting his tired face in jagged pieces. But what caught his attention was how clean everything looked underneath the dust, like the place had been carefully arranged before everyone left. The bottles were lined up neat and straight. The chairs were turned upside down on the tables, the way you do if you were closing up for the night and planning to come back in the morning. It gave him an uneasy feeling, like walking through a house where the family had just stepped out for a moment. Ezra left the saloon and continued down the street. A blacksmith shop sat empty, its forge cold and tools hanging in perfect order. On the walls, the hotel had 3 stories and looked like it could have housed 30 guests, but when he called out, his voice just echoed back from empty rooms. Even the livery stable was organized, with horse gear hung up neat and tidy, waiting for animals that would never come. At the far end of the street, a wooden sign caught his eye. It was newer than the others, painted in fresh black letters on white wood. Perdition Gulch, population 0. Someone had added that last part recently, maybe within the past year or two. Below it, in smaller letters, were the words, "May God have mercy on our souls." That sign sent a chill down Ezra's spine that had nothing to do with the desert evening. He'd heard stories about towns that died overnight. Plague, Indian raids, mining accidents that killed everyone at once. But this place felt different. It felt like the people had chosen to leave, like they'd walked away from something they couldn't face. The church sat at the center of town, surrounded by a small cemetery, with maybe 20 headstones. As Ezra got closer, he could see that the building was older than the others, built from different wood with different craftsmanship. While the other structures looked thrown together quickly during a mining rush, the church had been built to last. Its walls were straight and true, and the wooden cross on top still stood proud against the darkening sky. What surprised him most was how well preserved it looked. The other buildings showed years of neglect, with broken windows and sagging roofs. But the church windows were intact, and the door looked solid. Someone had been taking care of this place, even after the town died. Ezra tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The hinges creaked as the door swung open, but they held firm. He stepped inside and immediately felt the temperature drop. Desert churches were built to stay cool, with thick walls and high ceilings that kept the heat out even on the hottest days. The inside was simple but beautiful. 2 rows of wooden pews faced a small altar at the front. The wood was dark with age but polished to a soft glow. Sunlight streamed through windows made of colored glass, painting rainbow patterns on the floor. It reminded Ezra of the church his mother had taken him to as a boy, before his father died and everything fell apart. But it was what stood at the front of the church that made his blood run cold. Between the altar and the first row of pews sat a wooden casket. It was beautiful work, made from dark wood that had been carved with intricate patterns of flowers and vines. The kind of craftsmanship that cost serious money, the kind reserved for wealthy folks or people who'd done something important enough to be remembered. Ezra walked down the center aisle slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if his legs were turning to lead. Something about that casket drew him forward, even though every instinct told him to turn around and walk away. As he got closer, he could see a brass nameplate mounted on the lid. The metal had been polished recently and caught the colored light from the windows. When he was close enough to read it, Ezra's heart nearly stopped beating. The nameplate read, Ezra McCann, born 1845, died 1887. For a long moment, he just stood there staring at his own name carved in brass. This was 1887. He'd been born in 1845. The dates were exactly right, down to the year. His hands started shaking, and not from the sickness in his chest. This was something else entirely, something that made his skin crawl and his mind race with questions that had no good answers. Who knew his real name? He'd been using false names for years, staying one step ahead of the law by never being the same person twice in the same place. How could anyone know when he was born? His mother was dead, and he'd never told anyone his real birthday. Yet here it was, carved in brass on a casket that looked like it had been waiting for him. Ezra reached out with trembling fingers and touched the nameplate. The metal was real, solid, and cold under his fingertips. The carving was deep and professional, not something scratched on in a hurry. Someone had paid good money to have this made, and they'd known exactly what to put on it. But the strangest part was the death date. 1887, this year. As if whoever made this knew not just who he was and when he was born, but when he was going to die. The doctor in Silver City had said 6 months, maybe less. If the casket maker was right, Ezra didn't have much time left. His coughing fit hit him without warning, doubling him over and sending fresh blood onto the clean church floor. When it passed, he was gasping for air and leaning against the casket for support. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, dying on his feet while touching his own coffin, but as his breathing slowly returned to normal, Ezra noticed something. Else, the casket wasn't sealed. The lid was held down by simple brass latches, the kind that could be opened from the outside. And from where he stood, he could hear something that made his heart race all over again. From inside the casket came the soft, unmistakable sound of a baby crying. Ezra's hands froze on the brass latches. The crying from inside the casket was soft but clear, the unmistakable sound of a baby in distress. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. How could there be a living child inside a coffin that bore his name? Was his illness making him hear things that weren't there? He pressed his ear against the wooden lid, and the crying became more distinct. It wasn't his imagination. There was definitely someone alive in there, someone small and helpless who needed help. Despite every instinct telling him to run, Ezra knew he couldn't walk away from the sound of a child in trouble. His fingers trembled as he worked the first latch. The brass was well oiled and moved smoothly as if someone had maintained it recently. The second latch opened just as easily. As he lifted the heavy wooden lid, the crying grew louder, and late afternoon light spilled into the casket's interior. What Ezra saw inside nearly knocked him to his knees. Instead of his own body, or bones, or even an empty space, the casket held a living baby wrapped in white cloth. The infant looked to be maybe 3 or 4 months old, with tiny fists waving in the air and a red face scrunched up from crying. The child was clean and appeared healthy, though clearly upset about being confined in such a dark, cramped space. Ezra stared in shock, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. This made no sense at all. How had a baby gotten into his casket? Who would put a child in such a place? And how long had the infant been trapped in there? Moving carefully, as if afraid the whole scene might disappear, Ezra reached into the casket and gently lifted the baby out. The child was surprisingly light, and the crying began to quiet as soon as Ezra held him close to his chest. The warmth and movement seemed to comfort the infant, who had probably been alone in that dark space for who knows how long. As he cradled the baby awkwardly in his arms, Ezra noticed other things in the casket. Clean white blankets were folded neatly at one end. A small glass bottle that looked like it might be for feeding was tucked into one corner. And lying beside where the baby had been was an envelope made of fine paper, the kind wealthy people used for important letters. The envelope was addressed in elegant handwriting to the Gunslinger. Nothing more, no name, no formal address. Just those 3 words written in flowing script that spoke of education and refinement. Ezra sat down heavily in the front pew, still holding the baby who had now stopped crying completely. The infant's eyes were open, dark and alert, studying Ezra's weathered face with the serious expression babies sometimes get. It struck him how long it had been since he'd held a child. Years, maybe decades? The feeling brought back memories of his younger brother, who died of fever when Ezra was just 16. With his free hand, he opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was expensive, and the handwriting was the same elegant script as the address. As he began to read, his world turned upside down all over again. "My dear father," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have found your granddaughter, and I am likely no longer alive to explain how this came to pass." Ezra's eyes went wide. "Granddaughter? Father?" He read the line again, certain he'd misunderstood, but the words remained the same. He forced himself to continue reading, though. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper steady. "My name is Constance Whitmore, though I was born Constance McCann in Tucson 15 years ago. You knew my mother, Rebecca Shunn, who worked as a schoolteacher there. You may not remember her, as your time in Tucson was brief, but she never forgot." "You," the name hit Ezra like a punch to the gut. Rebecca Shunn, he did remember her, though he'd tried not to think about her for years. She'd been different from the other women he'd known. Quiet, intelligent, with kind eyes and gentle hands. They'd spent 3 weeks together while he recovered from a bullet wound in his shoulder. She'd tended his injury and shown him a kind of tenderness he'd never experienced before. When he'd healed enough to ride, he'd left Tucson without saying goodbye. It was what he always did. Never stay anywhere long enough to put down roots or hurt anyone who might care about him. He'd convinced himself it was better that way, safer for everyone involved. Now he was learning there had been consequences he'd never imagined, the letter continued. My mother raised me alone until I was 12, when she married Thomas Whitmore. A kind man who accepted me as his own daughter, Mr. Whitmore, gave me his name and treated me with love and respect, never making me feel like less than his blood child. When I married his business partner, James Morrison, 3 years ago, I thought my life was complete. Ezra looked down at the baby in his arms. If this letter was true, if Constance really was his daughter, then this infant was his granddaughter. The thought was almost too big to fit in his mind. He'd never imagined having a family, never thought about children or grandchildren. His life had been too dangerous, too uncertain for such normal things. Sadly, my husband James died of pneumonia last winter, leaving me alone with our baby daughter. I named her Hope because she represented all the good things I still believed were possible in the world. But 3 months ago, complications during childbirth took my life as well, leaving Hope an orphan with no immediate family to care for her. The baby, Hope, had fallen asleep in Ezra's arms, her tiny fingers wrapped around the edge of his vest. She felt so small and fragile, yet somehow peaceful now that she was out of the dark casket. Ezra found himself studying her face, looking for any resemblance to himself or to the woman he barely remembered from Tucson. Before I died, I made arrangements with my stepfather, Thomas Whitmore, regarding Hope's future. I told him about you, about how my mother had described a man who was dangerous but not evil, violent but not cruel. A man who had been shaped by hard circumstances but who still had goodness buried deep inside him. Ezra almost laughed at that description, but there was no humor in it. Goodness buried deep inside him? He'd spent 15 years robbing banks and running from the law. He'd killed men who tried to kill him first, but he'd still taken lives. What goodness could possibly be left after all the darkness he'd lived with? Mr. Whitmore hired investigators to find you, and they learned about your illness. They discovered that you have consumption and may not live much longer. When I heard this news, I made a decision that may seem strange, but I believe it was right. I asked Mr. Whitmore to arrange this meeting between you and Hope, in a place where you could face the truth about your life and decide what kind of man you want to be in whatever time remains. The letter went on to explain how Thomas Whitmore had used his considerable wealth and connections to set up this elaborate scene. He bought the entire ghost town of Perdition Gulch from the mining company that owned it. He'd had the casket specially made and arranged for it to be placed in the church, knowing that Ezra would eventually seek shelter there. The casket with your name was meant to make you confront your own mortality, the letter explained. But finding hope inside instead of death represents the choice that stands before you. You can continue running from your past until the consumption takes you, dying alone and forgotten. Or you can use whatever time you have left to do something meaningful, something that might balance the scales for the life you've lived. Ezra. Read the final paragraphs through tears he didn't realize he was shedding. Constance had written about Hope's needs, about the money Thomas Whitmore was willing to provide for her care, and about her belief that even a dying gunslinger might have something valuable to offer an innocent child. I don't expect you to raise her yourself, the letter concluded. Your life is too uncertain, and she deserves stability and safety. But perhaps you could stay with her long enough to see that she gets to people who will love her properly. Perhaps you could use your remaining time to be something more than just a man running from his past. Hope represents a chance for redemption, both for her and for you. What you choose to do with that chance will determine how your story truly ends. The letter was signed simply, Your daughter, Constance, with a date from 3 months earlier. Ezra folded the letter carefully and looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms. Hope, his granddaughter. The product of a love he'd run away from 15 years ago, now left alone in the world just as his own time was running out, outside the church. The sun was setting, painting the stained glass windows in deeper shades of red and gold. Ezra sat in the growing darkness, holding a child he'd never known existed, trying to figure out what to do next. For the first time in 15 years, the choices he made would affect someone other than himself, and for the first time in his adult life, Ezra McCann wanted to do the right thing. As darkness settled over the church, Ezra found himself studying every detail of baby Hope's face by the colored light filtering through the stained glass windows. She had Rebecca's eyes, he realized now. The same dark, intelligent look that had drawn him to her mother all those years ago in Tucson. But the shape of Hope's chin reminded him of his own mother, and her tiny hands had the long fingers that ran in his family. The reality of having a granddaughter was slowly sinking in, but it brought more questions than answers. How was he supposed to care for a baby when he could barely care for himself? He'd never changed a diaper, never prepared infant food, never done any of the 1,000 small things that keeping a child alive required. The consumption was getting worse every day, leaving him weaker and more tired. What if he had one of his bad coughing fits while holding her? But as if Thomas Whitmore had thought of everything, Ezra began noticing supplies that hadn't been there before, or maybe he'd been too shocked earlier to see them clearly. Behind the altar, he found a large basket filled with baby clothes, clean diapers, and several glass bottles. There were tins of condensed milk, boxes of crackers that babies could eat, and even a small pot for warming milk over a fire. A separate crate held men's supplies. Clean shirts, a warm coat, dried meat, coffee, and medical supplies, including a bottle of laudanum for pain. Someone had planned this down to the smallest detail, thinking about what both he and Hope would need during their time together. The generosity of it overwhelmed him. Thomas Whitmore was a man he'd never met. Yet this stranger was showing him more kindness than he'd received from anyone in years. Ezra carefully placed Hope back in the casket, now lined with soft blankets instead of the hard wood. She stirred but didn't wake, and he took the opportunity to explore more of the church. Behind a curtain near the back, he found a small room that must have served as the minister's office. It had been converted into a simple living space with a cot, a table, 2 chairs, and a small stove for cooking. On the table was another letter, this one much longer and written in different handwriting. The signature at the bottom read Thomas Whitmore, and as Ezra read by lamplight, he began to understand just how much planning had gone into this moment. Whitmore's letter explained that he'd spent the better part of 2 years tracking Ezra's movements. His investigators had found people in a dozen towns who remembered the Gunslinger, building a picture of a man who was dangerous but not cruel, violent when necessary but never vicious for its own sake. They'd learned about his habit of seeking shelter in churches when wounded or tired, and about his preference for isolated places when he felt cornered. "I want you to understand," Whitmore had written, "that I did not arrange this meeting out of anger or a desire for revenge. Constance spoke of you with curiosity, not bitterness. She understood that her mother had chosen to keep your identity secret, and she respected that choice. But she also believed that every person deserved a chance at redemption, no matter how far they had fallen." The letter went on to describe Constance herself, and Ezra found himself hungry for every detail about the daughter he'd never known. She'd been smart like her mother, always reading and asking questions that made adults think. She'd learned to play piano and spoke 3 languages. She'd married young but to a good man who treated her well. She'd wanted children and had been overjoyed when Hope was born, despite the dangers of childbirth that ultimately claimed her life. "She made me promise," Whitmore continued, "that if anything happened to her, I would find you and give you the choice to be part of Hope's life. Not to force you into responsibility you didn't want, but to offer you the chance to know your granddaughter before it was too late. She believed that even if you chose to walk away, you deserved to know that your life had created something beautiful." Ezra set the letter down and rubbed his eyes. Outside, he could hear Dusty moving around, probably looking for grass to eat. He should tend to his horse, but he was afraid to leave Hope alone even for a few minutes. What if she woke up scared? What if something happened while he was outside? The thought surprised him. When had he started feeling protective of this child? He'd known of her existence for less than 4 hours, yet already he was worrying about her comfort and safety. It was a feeling he'd almost forgotten he was capable of having. He went back to check on Hope and found her awake, looking around with those serious dark eyes. When she saw him, she didn't cry, just watched him with the patient expression babies sometimes have, as if they're trying to figure out who you are and whether you can be trusted. Ezra picked her up carefully, supporting her head the way he dimly remembered doing with his little brother years ago. "Hello there, little one," he said softly. "I guess I'm your grandfather. Not much of one, I'll admit, but it's what you've got?" Hope made a small sound, not quite crying but not quite content either. Ezra realized she was probably hungry. It had been hours since he'd found her, and babies needed to eat regularly. He carried her to the supplies and tried to figure out how to prepare a bottle with one hand while holding her with the other. It took him 3 tries to get the milk mixed right and warmed to a temperature that didn't make Hope fuss. When he finally got the bottle to her lips, she drank eagerly, making small, satisfied sounds that warmed something deep in his chest. He'd never thought of himself as someone who could take care of another person, but watching Hope drink her milk gave him a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. As she drank, Ezra found himself talking to her, telling her about her grandmother Rebecca and what he remembered of their time together in Tucson. How Rebecca had been patient with his rough manners and had tried to teach him to read better. How she'd made him laugh with stories about her students and their funny questions. How she'd bandaged his wounded shoulder with gentle hands and never asked about the bullet hole or how he'd gotten it. "She was too good for me," he told Hope. "I knew that even then. That's why I left without saying goodbye. I thought I was protecting her from the trouble that followed me everywhere. Turns out I was just protecting myself from getting too attached to something good." Hope finished her bottle and looked up at him with sleepy eyes. Ezra held her against his shoulder, patting her back gently until she burped, then rocked her until she fell asleep again. The simple act of caring for her needs filled him with a peace. He hadn't known he was missing as he sat in the lamplight holding his sleeping granddaughter. Ezra began to understand what Thomas Whitmore and Constance had been trying to give him. Not just knowledge of Hope's existence, but a chance to experience what it felt like to put someone else's needs before his own. To be useful in a way that had nothing to do with how fast he could draw his gun or how well he could disappear into the desert. For the first time in 15 years, Ezra McCann felt like he might be exactly where he was supposed to be, but even as that thought brought him comfort, he knew the practical problems remained. He was dying, probably faster than Thomas Whitmore's investigators had calculated. The consumption was getting worse, and he couldn't hide from Hope how sick he really was. She needed someone who could care for her for years, not weeks or months. The smart thing would be to wait for Whitmore's men to come collect her, as the letter indicated they would. But as he looked down at Hope's peaceful face, Ezra realized he didn't want to give her up just yet. Maybe it was selfish, but he wanted a little more time to be a grandfather. Time to prove to himself, and maybe to her, that he could be something more than just a dying outlaw. Outside, the desert wind whistled through the empty streets of Perdition Gulch, but inside the church, Ezra McCann sat holding the most precious thing he'd ever touched, trying to figure out how to make the most of whatever time they had left together. The days that followed blurred together in a way that felt both peaceful and urgent. Ezra had never been good at keeping track of time, but now each moment seemed precious because he was sharing it with Hope. He fell into a routine that surprised him with its simple satisfaction. Wake before dawn, tend to Dusty, prepare Hope's bottle, change her diaper, then sit in the morning light watching her discover the world around her. His coughing fits were getting worse, but they seemed to come less often when he was focused on caring for Hope. Maybe it was having something important to do that kept the sickness at bay, or maybe he was just too distracted to notice the pain in his chest. Either way, he found himself able to function better than he had in weeks. Hope was an easy baby, content to lie on the blankets he'd spread near the altar, reaching for the colored light that danced through the stained glass windows. She rarely cried, and when she did, it was usually for simple things: food, a clean diaper, or just the comfort of being held. Ezra discovered he had a natural instinct for reading her needs, something that amazed him given his complete lack of experience with children. On the third morning, he found a well behind the church that still held sweet water. It had been covered with wooden boards to keep animals and debris out, another sign of Thomas Whitmore's thorough planning. The water allowed him to keep Hope clean and comfortable, and to prepare her bottles properly. It also meant he could stay in Perdition Gulch longer without worrying about running out of supplies. Ezra began talking to Hope constantly, partly to keep her entertained, and partly because he found he had things to say that he'd never told anyone. He told her about places he'd seen during his years of wandering, desert sunsets that painted the whole sky red and gold, mountain streams so clear you could see fish swimming in them from 50 feet away, stars so bright in empty country that they seemed close enough to touch. He also told her about the mistakes he'd made and the people he'd hurt. Not the details, since she was too young to understand, but the feelings behind them. How fear had made him run from anything good in his life. How pride had kept him from asking for help when he needed it. How loneliness had made him hard and suspicious of everyone's motives. "I don't want you to make the same mistakes I did," he said one afternoon as she lay on her blanket, watching dust motes dance in the sunlight. "When good people come into your life, don't push them away because you're afraid of getting hurt. Being alone might feel safer, but it's not really living." Hope made one of her small sounds, as if she was trying to answer him. Ezra smiled and touched her tiny hand with one finger. She grabbed onto it with surprising strength, holding tight as if she didn't want him to go anywhere. The gesture filled him with warmth and sadness at the same time. By the fourth day, Ezra could feel his strength fading in a way that couldn't be ignored. The consumption was taking more out of him, and he was having trouble staying on his feet for long periods. But instead of the panic he'd expected, he felt a strange calm settling over him. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't running from anything. He was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. That evening, as Hope slept peacefully in her makeshift bed, Ezra sat at the small table in the back room and began writing his own letter. His handwriting was rough compared to Thomas Whitmore's elegant script, but he wanted to leave something behind that explained what these few days had meant to him. "To Mr. Thomas Whitmore," he began, "and to Hope when she's old enough to understand. I want you to know that finding Hope has been the greatest gift of my life, even though I know I can't keep her. She's shown me what it feels like to put someone else first, and that's something I never thought I was capable of learning." He wrote about the peace he'd found in caring for Hope, and how her presence had made his final days meaningful instead of just a countdown to death. He described watching her sleep and wondering what kind of person she'd grow up to be. He hoped she'd have her great-grandmother Rebecca's kindness and intelligence, but also the strength to stand up for herself in a world that could be hard on women. "I know I can't raise her myself," he continued. "I'm too sick and my life has been too rough to give her the stability she needs. But I want Mr. Whitmore to know that she be loved no matter who raises her. She's got a spark in her that reminds me of all the best parts of the people I've known. Take care of that spark. Help it grow into something bright." The letter took him most of the night to write. His hand shook more as the hours passed, and he had to stop frequently to catch his breath or wipe blood from his lips. But he kept going because he wanted to get the words right. This might be the only thing he ever left behind that mattered, and he wanted it to be worthy of Hope. He wrote about practical things too. How Hope liked to be held close when she was fussy, and how she seemed to enjoy hearing people talk even when she couldn't understand the words. How she slept better with a little light coming through the windows, and how she got excited when birds sang outside in the morning. Small details that might help whoever took care of her next. As dawn broke on what Ezra somehow knew would be his last day, he sealed the letter in an envelope he'd found among the supplies. Then he picked up Hope, who was just beginning to wake, and carried her to the front of the church. He wanted to spend his final hours in the sanctuary where he'd first found her, surrounded by the colored light that seemed to make everything more beautiful. Hope was particularly alert that morning. looking around with bright eyes and making soft sounds that almost seemed like she was trying to talk. Ezra held her close, memorizing the weight of her in his arms and the way she smelled like soap and milk and innocence. He sang to her old songs his mother had sung to him before the world turned hard. His voice was rough and weak, but Hope seemed to enjoy the sound. "You're going to have a good life," he whispered to her as the morning light grew stronger. "People who care about you are coming to take you somewhere safe. You won't remember me when you grow up, but that's okay. What matters is that you're going to be loved and protected and given chances to become whoever you're meant to be." The coughing fit that finally claimed him was gentler than the others had been. It came on gradually, giving him time to lay Hope carefully on the soft blankets beside him before the weakness took over. As his vision grew dark around the edges, the last thing he saw was Hope's face looking up at him with those serious dark eyes, as if she was trying to comfort him instead of the other way around. When Thomas Whitmore's men arrived 2 days later, they found Ezra McCann sitting peacefully in the front pew of the church, his head tilted back and his eyes closed. His face looked more at rest than anyone who'd known his reputation would have expected. In his arms, clean and well-fed and somehow still content, was baby Hope. The men found Ezra's letter on the altar along with detailed notes about Hope's care and feeding schedule. Everything was organized and thoughtful, the work of a man who'd spent his final days making sure someone else would be taken care of after he was gone. They buried Ezra McCann in the cemetery behind the church, in the shadow of the building where he'd found his redemption. The wooden cross they placed over his grave was simple but well made, carved with his name and the dates from the brass nameplate that had brought him to this place. Below that, they added words from his own letter he learned to love at the end. Hope grew up in Thomas Whitmore's house, surrounded by books and music and people who cared about her future. She never knew the full story of the gunslinger who'd spent his last days caring for her, but she grew up strong and kind and curious about the world, exactly as he'd hoped she would. Sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings, Thomas Whitmore would tell her stories about a man who'd found peace in an abandoned church, and about how love could bloom even in the most unexpected places. And Hope would listen with the same serious dark eyes that had watched over Ezra McCann during the most important days of his life.